walked backstage. Is that correct?
Correct.
No one stopped you?
No one stopped us, no.
No one gave you permission to go backstage. You simply went backstage.
Correct.
Your husband next says that you were surrounded by water on 3 sides. It was so quiet and calm you could just about hear a pin drop.
I agree. It was very quiet.
Now, you testified that Mr. Dillon, you allegedly saw Mr. Dillon, and he got up to the first step of the bus, and then he stopped and took a step and looked back at us. And then your husband walked toward him, and then Mr. Dillon started to walk back. That was your testimony. When you said walk back, what did you mean by that? I'm not asking about what your husband says here. I'm asking about your testimony.
Right.
You said during your testimony that Mr. Dillon took a step on the bus, took a step off, looked back at us, and then your husband walked toward him, and you testified that Mr. Dillon started to walk back. What did you mean by
I meant back towards the area where we were.
So it's your testimony that Mr. Dillon walked onto the bus, and you saw his back.
I could see his back, yes.
And then, with one foot on the bus, he turned around and started walking toward you.
Right, back away from the step.
So, his back was toward you at first, one step on the bus. And then, rather than continuing to walk onto the bus, he turned around, got off the bus, and started to walk toward you.
Yes.
And when he turned around, did he do that in response to you calling out his name?
I don't know.
Well, did you call out his name, Mr. Dillon?
No, I didn't.
Did your husband, as Mr. Dillon was walking on the bus, and as Mr. Dillon's back was to you, call out Mr. Dillon?
No.
Mr. Dillon just turned around as he was walking onto the bus.
Yes.
And your testimony is that he started walking toward you and your husband?
I didn't say he walked towards us. I said he walked, I'll phrase it differently, he walked away. It seemed like he turned around and walked back away from the step that he was going up.
How far were you and your husband from the bus?
Oh. I would say it was probably maybe 10 feet.
And what kind of bus was it?
It was a large, looked from what I've seen of tour buses, it looked like a large tour bus.
And it was still raining hard at this time?
I don't recall.
It was still raining?
I believe so.
And your husband, on page 12 of this exhibit, states that Mr. Dillon took his foot down and started walking toward me. You testified that Mr. Dillon started to walk back. I want you now to recall what you saw, what you claim you saw when Mr. Dillon turned around off the bus and reversed direction. Was he walking toward you and your husband?
In our direction, yes.
Well, what do you mean when you say in our direction?
Well, he wasn't walking, say the bus was up there at the end of the table and we were back here. He was walking back this way rather than over to the right or left.
Did he appear to be walking purposely toward you and your husband?
The appearance was that it could have been. I mean, I'm not, can you rephrase that question?
Did he appear, when he turned around and allegedly got off the bus, did he appear to be walking purposely toward you and your husband, as opposed to just happen to be walking in a direction which was in some proximity to you and your husband?
I'll say the former.
The first or the second?
First.
Purposely toward you and your husband?
Yes.
And what do you base that on?
I base it on the fact that he didn't continue on to the bus. He stopped and turned around and came back.
And before he allegedly reversed directions on the bus to walk toward you and Mr. Damiano, had Mr. Dillon allegedly seen you and Mr. Damiano?
Had he seen us sitting there?
Correct.
I would have thought he would, because he passed right by us.
And when he passed right by you, are you claiming that he looked at you?
I don't know.
Did you see him look at you?
No.
Your husband in his statement said that after Mr. Dillon allegedly started walking toward him, he, quote, stood up and walked toward him, meaning Mr. Dillon. And then he says he got within an arm's reach of Mr. Dillon. How close did your husband get to Mr. Dillon as you observed it?
As close as we are?
That's about 5 feet or so? 6 feet?
Could have been a little closer.
Closer than
It
5
could
or
have
6
been,
feet?
right. Possibly.
Were they standing face to
4
face?
feet. Yes. I mean, it's face to face in terms of like we are right now, or one person.
The record should reflect, by the way, that you two are no more than 4 feet away from each other.
4 or 5 feet.
Right.
Do you claim that you and your husband were 4 feet or so apart from each other? You and Mr.
Jim and I, yes.
Mr. Dillon and your husband?
Mr. Dillon and my husband, yes.
So your testimony is, just so I can understand it, Mr. Dillon came out of a door. By the way, what kind of door was it?
A back door. I don't.
Back door to what?
A back door to the stage area, like a stage back door.
And how many people do you claim were with him when he exited this door?
Approximately 5.
Can you describe any of those people?
No, not specifically.
Can you describe them in any manner?
I believe that they were a mixture of men, female and male.
And do you know how many men and how many women allegedly exited the door with Mr. Dillon approximately 45 minutes after the concert?
No.
And how was Mr. Dillon dressed that evening?
I remember specifically he was in a gray sweatshirt with a hooded gray sweatshirt, and the hood was up over his head.
Do you recall what kind of pants he was wearing?
No.
Did he have a beard? Was it shaven?
I'm not sure. I believe he might have had a little bit of a beard.
Mm-hmm. And then your testimony is that Mr. Dillon walked onto the bus, put one foot on, turned around, not in response to anything you or your husband said.
Correct.
Your husband started walking toward Mr. Dillon. Mr. Dillon purposely started walking toward your husband until they got about 4 feet from one another. Is that correct so far?
Correct.
And then your husband's statement states that he handed out the book and started to say, "Anthony Tiller told me to bring you those songs," when suddenly the large man who had come out earlier swung his hand down and said, "Hold it." In your testimony, you didn't make any mention of your husband saying that or a large man swinging his hand down and stating, "Hold it." Did you
Are
recall?
you advising her
I'm asking a question. Do you recall?
Excuse me.
I'm asking. Do you recall?
I recall a
whether
large man.
Do you recall whether your husband stated, as he allegedly was 4 feet or so from Mr. Dillon, "Anthony Tiller told me to bring you these songs"? Do you recall your husband stating that on July 1st, 1988?
I'm going to object to the pre-question commentary
Do you recall
Which
that?
was not a question.
Do you recall that, Mrs. Damiano? As you sit here today, thinking back on what happened backstage.
Right. I recall that he did say something to him. I didn't hear his exact words.
And when you said to him, your husband allegedly was talking to Mr. Dillon?
When he said this, when he made this statement, yes.
Well, you don't remember him making this statement.
Or when he said whatever he said.
Is it that you didn't hear what he said,
I
or you
couldn't
don't
hear
remember what he
exactly.
said?
No, I couldn't hear it. I know he said something, but I couldn't hear exactly what his words were.
How close to your husband were you at this point?
I was probably about maybe 5 feet, 6 feet. I was back, and he walked forward.
And let me ask you this, Mrs. Damiano. With these 5 or so other people with Mr. Dillon, did they get on the bus before Mr. Dillon did? Or were they behind Mr. Dillon as he was walking on the bus?
It seemed like he was in the middle of the group. It seemed like there were a few ahead of him and some people in back of him. So it was like a line of people.
And when Mr. Dillon got off the bus, allegedly in reverse direction, were there people standing behind him waiting to get on the bus?
I don't recall, but I believe so.
Do you recall whether he had to walk around people who were standing behind him in order to purposely walk toward your husband?
I don't recall.
And do you recall, Mrs. Damiano, whether there were people, his entourage allegedly, who were milling about and not walking onto the bus while this all was allegedly happening?
In terms of, no, I don't recall anyone milling about.
And as you sit here today, you don't recall the order in which these 6 individuals, including Mr. Dillon, were allegedly proceeding to the bus?
The order in terms of...
You said he was about in the middle.
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Do you remember a large man coming out and swinging his hand down?
Yes.
And by swinging his hand down, withdrawn. Well, your husband describes it as swinging his hand down. Is that an accurate description of what the man did?
Something like putting your arm, when you say swinging your hand down, it could be like you're going like this to take something, or to put your arm down. So it's actually your arm and your hand.
What was your husband allegedly doing when this large man allegedly came out and swung his hand down?
What was he doing? He was standing there.
Well, what, if anything, was your husband doing that caused this man to swing his hand down? Was the man just swinging his hand down in the air?
Well, he had the envelope with his lyrics inside of it, and he had it out, extended out, as if to hand it to someone.
Was your husband... Are you testifying that your husband was beginning to hand the book to Mr. Dillon?
Yes.
I'm not asking you to look at the statement. I'm asking you to remember what you saw.
Yes.
You remember seeing that as you sit here today?
Yes.
Why don't you describe what you remember seeing?
Jim had his envelope with his lyrics in it. He held it out. Mr. Dillon was coming from the bus area back. Jim extended the envelope out, and then this large man, who was the one who came out initially and looked at us and went back in the backstage door, came in between the two of them.
And when your husband allegedly extended the book out, was Mr. Dillon still on the bus?
No.
Was he walking toward your husband?
He was there. He wasn't walking at that point. He had stopped walking.
So there came a time, your testimony is, when Mr. Dillon and your husband were there backstage standing face to face.
Yes.
Looking at each other.
Yes.
How long would you estimate that Mr. Dillon and your husband were backstage looking at each other face to face?
Not very long.
How long would you estimate?
45 seconds, a minute, a couple of minutes. You know, it could have been, I can't really say exactly how much time it was.
So your testimony is that Mr. Dillon reversed direction